In this week's Parshas VaYechi, which brings the same preparations to a close, we have a very famous interchange between Yaakov Avinu and Yosef regarding his sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And we know that ultimately, Yaakov Avinu turns to Yosef and he informs him that not only were those two sons elevated to the status of Shiftei Kah, being names within the 12 tribes of Klal Yisrael, not only were they afforded a Nachal in Eretz Yisrael by name, not only were they effectively part of the Degolim, part of the pageantry, of the flags on the different sides of the Mishkan, and on the sides of the Aron Kodesh accompanying Yaakov Avinu to his ultimate burial place, the Moras HaMachpelah, but rather, B'cha Yivarach Yisrael Leimar. We know that on Friday nights, it's customary that a father places his hands upon the head of his son, and he says, Yisimcha Elohim ke'Ephraim v'chem Manasseh. Some do this only on the eve of Yom Kippur. Some do this on Rosh Hashanah, and some do it every single Friday night and every single Yom Tov night. Why is it that specifically Ephraim and Manasseh were chosen by Yaakov Avinu to be the bracha par excellence conveyed upon all of our grandsons? Now, one could readily answer that the reason is that Yaakov Avinu looked at the end of his life and he realized that his life and the lives of his entire household, of his children and grandchildren, were actually spared. The continuity of Klal Yisrael was ensured solely by Yosef HaTzadik, bringing them down to the land of Egypt, sequestering them in the area of Goshen, separate and afar from the rest of the Egyptians, and ensuring that there would be a continuity for Klal Yisrael. And therefore, perhaps he says, B'cha Yivarach Yisrael Leimar Yisimcha Elohim ke'Ephraim v'chem Manasseh. It could also be because Yaakov Avinu understood clearly that whereas all of his other grandchildren born at that point in time had received their education within the household of Yaakov Avinu in the land of Israel, it was only Ephraim and Manasseh who were never part of that child rearing, of that grandchild rearing. They never saw Eretz Yisrael. They never benefited from living in a frum community, and yet they became Ephraim and Manasseh. And therefore, the bracha that we give our sons is Yisimcha Elohim ke'Ephraim v'chem Manasseh. But I'd like to suggest a third reason, and it actually has to do with a grandfather, and it has to do with outcasts. We read in the Sedra, this forthcoming Shabbos Kodesh, that when Yaakov Avinu are presented by Yosef with these two sons in front of him, Yaakov Avinu looks, Vayar Yisolos ben Yosef, he looks at them and he says, Vayomer mi ela, who are these? Rashi cites the Chazal that explained that he saw that there were those who issued forth from these two children who didn't seem to be particularly compatible with the desires of a Yaakov Avinu and of Klal Yisrael. He saw Yeravam and Achav issuing forth from Ephraim, and Yehu and his sons from Manasseh. But the Targum Yonasan ben Uziel explains differently. He explains that Yaakov Avinu looked at Ephraim and Manasseh in front of their father Yosef, and he said, Mi Ela, who's their mother? Where do these children come from? Min man is yalidu loch elaim. Who's their mother? And Yosef HaTzadik responds to him. He says, who's their mother? Kedenk Sava, the Ole Nesevis, Yas Osnas Brasdina Baratach Leintu. Yosef said to Yaakov Avinu, when I was being paraded through the streets of Egypt, after I interpreted the dreams of Paro, and I was appointed as viceroy, and all the women were scaling the walls, as it were, to note my handsomeness and to throw themselves at me as a potential spouse, one of them threw something at me, and I saw that it was inscribed upon it, Kol Misha Davat Bezu Harezem Zera Yaakov. Anyone who ultimately produces children through the woman who was wearing this amulet or coin, whatever it was, around her neck, why, they should know that she is from the descendants of Yaakov Avinu. Now look at this, please. Yosef HaTzadik, was Yosef HaTzadik able to retain all that Yaakov Avinu had given him and taught him and entrusted to him for perpetuity alone in the bowels of the land of Egypt, without another Jew around. Yosef HaTzadik. But he was at the beginning of the day, and at the end of the day in the bracha given to him by Yaakov Avinu, described as Nazir Echav. Not Nazir Echav solely meaning the crown of all his brothers, but Nazir Echav, the one who was kept at a distance from his brothers, because he was their outcast. Why, according to the Sfarno, the brothers had paskin the din misa, that he was a rodef, and they strongly considered killing him. It was only Reuven who stopped it. They would have killed him. Yosef was such an outcast, based upon the lashon hara that he had brought to their father Yaakov about them. But he was the outcast par excellence. And the daughter of Dinah, having been taken against her will by Shem, giving birth to a daughter, Chazal tell us that this daughter was taken by Yaakov Avinu, and she was sent away for reasons that are not necessarily simply explained. But she was sent away. Around her neck, being attested to as coming from the house of Yaakov Avinu. Was she not an outcast? And Yaakov Avinu turns to Yosef and says, Mi'ela, who are these? And Yosef says, who are these? Who are these children that are presented before you? Bonai Haim, Asher Nasani Elohim Bazeh. They are the children who are granted to me by Kadosh Baruch Hu through the agency of this woman, who is your granddaughter, the daughter of Dinah. Yosef was an outcast. Dinah was an outcast. And together they produced Ephraim and Manasseh. What did the pasuk tell us? Vayishak lahem, vayichabek lahem. He kissed them and he embraced them. And when he heard and understood clearly who they were, he said unequivocally, the greatest bracha that any parent could give a son is that no matter that at times that child may be viewed as an outcast by a rabbi, by peers, lo aleinu, by parents, but in the eyes of a grandparent, of a zayda, because the greatest of people for our future and the greatest of people for our emulation could indeed be the byproduct of outcasts or the outcasts themselves. Isn't it a funny thing that in Yiddish there's a word for daughter, tochter, there's a word for son, azun. Different genders. But there's only one word for a grandson or a granddaughter, and that's an einikel. Because a wise person once said, by parents it matters at times, whether it should or it shouldn't, a son or a daughter. By a grandparent, there is no difference. There's no nafkamina, there's no chiluk, whether it's a grandson or a granddaughter. B'chai yevarach Yisrael, yisimcha lehim ke'Ephraim v'chem Manasseh. All of Klal Yisrael are to be embraced. And as we embrace them, we draw them near. We make them part of our bracha, of our blessing, and we make them part of our collective future. Have a wonderful Shabbos.